And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are the cards that I think you need to be aware of if you are playing the Commander format. I think there's a lot of people out there, myself included, that thought that the Doctor Who stuff, like I actually thought they were done. They had spoiled a bunch of stuff back in August or maybe early as September, and I thought that was it. I was going to make a video about it, and then all of a sudden they started spoiling more stuff. I thought it was going to be like The Walking Dead. It was like we had maybe 8 or 10 commanders and then a few other cards, and that's it. I did not actually realize it was going to be a giant set. And I think a lot of other people, I mean, I've talked to people who did not realize this was actually going to be a full-on set like Lord of the Rings. So, I mean, there's a lot of cards to talk about. And it's going to be impactful for the Commander format. And so for the people that really like these cards, you know, again, everyone has their opinions here, okay? For the people that really like these cards, really like Doctor Who, whatever the case may be, these are going to be cards that, you know, I think are very notable. And for the people who don't, right, if you're watching this video, you're like, oh, Doctor Who, turn that off. Okay, if you're playing the Commander format, you're a regular viewer of mine, you're playing the Commander format, I'm talking about these specific cards because they're cards that you need to be aware of. So even if you're not going to play any of these cards, even if you're, right, so that's how I'm sort of divvying up the review videos that I'm doing for this set. I'm going to do another one for the Commanders as well, for which there's a ton. These are cards that you have to be aware of. They now exist in the Commander, you know, whenever they're going to be legal in the Commander format, they exist in the Commander format, and you should be aware of them, right? Just like it's, you know, it's better for every Commander player to be aware of certain cards existing so that you know that they're out there. So that's what this video is about. I'm picking out the cards that I think, yes, are really good Commander cards. And so because they're really good Commander cards, they're going to get played in the format. So you're going to come across them. And it's good for you to be aware of these cards, even if you don't plan on playing any of these Doctor Who cards. Okay. So I got 17 cards to talk about that I think are very notable. I'm going to start with Everybody Lives, which I already talked about. In fact, the first 3 are the ones that I already talked about, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them. 1 and a white instant, all creatures gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Players gain hexproof until end of turn. Players can't lose life this turn. Players can't lose the game or win the game this turn. So obviously, this absolutely for sure is going to get played in the Commander format. Like I said in that video, I think it's going to even get played in CEDH because your opponents can't win the game, you can't lose the game thing can be really, really impactful, obviously. I mean, this can be an incredibly impactful card in a Commander game, in any Commander game, for a lot of different reasons. So this is why you have to be aware this card exists, because you're like, oh, I'm going to win the game. And then somebody casts this card and you're like, what is that? Right? You didn't even know it existed. So again, that's sort of the stuff that I'm talking about here, where you got to know these cards exist. They are going to be legal in the Commander format, whether you like the Doctor Who cards or not. And this is certainly going to be a popular card in the Commander format, and it's going to be an impactful one for sure. Also talked about Reverse the Polarity, which again is, I was pretty high on it when I first saw it. I'm a little less high on it now. Like, I'm just trying to figure out where I'm going to play this. And the reason why is because of what it's doing, right? 1 blue instant, choose 1. And I always like modal cards in the Commander format. Counter all other spells. Switch each creature's power and toughness until end of turn, and creatures can't be blocked this turn. So again, I think this is going to be a pretty popular card in the format. It's, as a counterspell, it's not great. I think it's probably the way it's going to be used the most. So that's where I'm like, okay, it's probably going to be used as a counterspell more than those other modes, way more. But also as a counterspell, it's not great. So it's like, you know, I'm thinking of maybe my 2 mono blue decks where I was like, man, would I take a counterspell out to put this in? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. It is certainly going to be a card that's played in the Commander format, and you should be aware of it. You know, maybe you want to play it, maybe you don't. Either way, it's definitely going to be a card that's going to see play in the Commander format. I also talked about Ominus Cemetery, which, because it's a colorless land, the easiest thing to shoehorn into any Commander deck is a colorless land, because of course, it being colorless, it can go in any deck, and being a land, it's very easy to put in any deck. So it's a land, taps to add a colorless, of course, but also you can pay 5 and tap, exile Ominus Cemetery. Target creature's owner shuffles it into their library. So not the best ever, but a pretty decent way to deal with a creature. And on a land, I think it's probably the best way to deal with a creature. I guess you could even use it on yourself. I mean, there is that opportunity as well. I don't know why you would do that. I guess if you had a creature that is just really important, maybe you've had a secret commander, right? See, there's another way to use this card outside of the more obvious ways. Is I'm playing a secret commander deck, and of course, if you're playing that secret commander, you don't mind if it's in your library because you probably already have a whole bunch of ways to go get it anyway. So now I can use my land to shuffle it into my library so I can go get it again rather than it being like exiled or something where I can't get it again. So, there's just a million ways to use this card, and it very easily slots into any deck. It's not the greatest card ever. It's certainly not fantastic creature removal, but because it so easily slots into decks, I think it might be, maybe, it's hard to say. Again, the fact that these are Doctor Who cards, that plays a lot into it as well, where you have a whole bunch of players that are not going to touch these cards because they're Doctor Who cards, and you're going to have a whole bunch of players that are going to play more of these cards or play certain cards because they just like that, particular character or that particular whatever from the show, right? So that's going to play into a lot as well. But again, being objective outside of the show, this to me is the card that I think is going to get played most in the format because it just so easily slots into a lot of decks, and it can, in some situations even save the game for you. All right, getting on to some more stuff here. Return the Past, 4 red enchantment. As long as it's your turn, each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard has flashback. Its flashback cost equal to mana cost. Of course, we've seen this a million times on other cards, but this is just a red enchantment that's going to sit on the battlefield, and you can just, on your turn, cast all your instant sorceries from your graveyard. That's great value. I think it's particularly great value in a red deck. I know people are going to look at this and go, okay, well, that goes in all the Izzet Spellslinger decks. I mean, sure, if you can find room for it, because there's so much support there already. But I'm considering this for my Browlin deck because there's a deck where it's not a Spellslinger theme, but I do have a fair amount of instant sorceries in that deck, like every commander deck does, or most. So I discard a lot. I have a lot of discard outlets, and I also need those discard triggers. So I can discard that Braid, for example, that I have in the deck, and then just cast it later from my graveyard, right? So that's why, it's getting a little tight in that deck, but there's a lot of situations where this card can get played. Again, if you're not a big Doctor Who guy, and you see this card, you're like, oh, right? There's not a big Doctor Who theme, although I'm sure there's something playing into the show from this. But this just looks like a normal Magic card. So maybe you just want to throw this in your deck because it works really, really well, right? All right, Surge of Brilliance, 1 and a blue, instant. Draw a card for each spell you've cast this turn from anywhere other than your hand. And there is a really big theme in this set. I'm going to talk about a few cards here. There's a few commanders even that are doing the cast it anywhere other than your hand. And particular card I'll be talking about in a 5 cards video coming up that started playing in a certain deck that I was playtesting, and I was like, man, this works really good. And that phrasing, they did the cast it from exile thing quite a bit, but now they're just starting to do cast it anywhere other than your hand, which of course works with the card we just talked about, Flashback, because that's casting from your graveyard. It works with casting from exile. It works with casting from the top of your library. It works with a lot of different scenarios. There's more and more decks where a card like this is going to fit. It also has Foretell, which of course also works because Foretell is casting from exile. So I can foretell it for 1 and a blue. Again, the way the stack works, all of that, what this says is draw a card for each spell you've cast this turn from anywhere other than your hand. So if I foretell this and then I cast it from Foretell, I've now cast a spell from somewhere other than my hand. I cast it from exile. So when this spell resolves, right, it's going to look at all the stuff that I've cast from, anywhere else, and I've cast this from somewhere else. So the bare minimum here is always going to be 1, right? Now, of course, 2 mana draw 1 card is terrible, but 2 mana draw 2 cards is pretty darn good. That's not bad, right? It's not great. It's not mind-blowing, but if you have any deck in blue that is casting stuff from, all those different scenarios, this seems like I won't say an auto-include, but a pretty great draw option, because all I have to do is cast 1 spell, right? So now I cast something from exile, then I have this sitting in Foretell, and I cast this guy. I am now paying 2 mana to draw 2 cards, which is pretty darn good. And of course, the sky's the limit from there, right? So I think there's definitely going to be a card that's going to see play in the format, and in any scenario like that, it's pretty darn good. Keeping with the same theme, Flaming Tyrannosaurus, and funny enough, this is a dinosaur. And they have a few, again, I never watched the show, but there's a lot of time traveling going on, obviously. So I guess they go back in time where there's dinosaurs. And as we probably are all very aware of, there is a dinosaur themed set coming up in the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, which we've already seen some spoilers. And they got a few dinosaurs in this set. run, and I think they even have one that is a dinosaur tribal theme. So I'm sure that's not a coincidence. But this one isn't doing the dinosaur tribal thing. It's just a dinosaur, just happens to be. But again, fits with the theme that I was just talking about, of casting spells from anywhere else. So 5 red, it's expensive. It is a dinosaur. 7 mana is a lot, yes. 5/5 with menace, but it's got a really great ability here if you're doing any of those themes. So whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, again, I think they are now adopting this phrase. They might be phasing out the cast from exile thing, right? Just like they phased out the cast it from your hand. They started not doing that. Phrasing used to be, when this creature enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, you get this effect. But of course, that doesn't work great in a lot of, again, doesn't work with the Exile Tribal, doesn't work if you cast from the command zone, all that kind of stuff. So what they started phasing out that phrase, and they started using the phrase, if you cast it. That's it. Just when this creature enters the battlefield, if you cast it. So they don't care where you cast it from, just that you cast it. And again, I think they're going to start phasing out the phrase cast from exile, maybe, and move to cast from anywhere other than your hand. So that includes the command zone. So just casting your commander is going to trigger this guy, right? Flaming Tyrannosaur deals 3 damage to any target. So anytime I cast a spell from anywhere other than my hand, deals 3 damage to any target. So again, if we're teaming up with that Return the Past thing, now I'm casting stuff from my graveyard, and every time I do so, I'm going to be hitting any target for, I'm going to be lightning bolting like nobody's business. That's pretty great. And you're putting a +1/+1 counter on this guy, which is great value for doing that. I mean, 7 mana is a lot, but that's pretty great value if you're doing it repeatedly. Then also, when Flaming Tyrannosaur dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So yeah, you can attack with this guy. I mean, even if I get this guy down, like again, 7 mana is a lot, but man, is it worth it? I think this guy is. Even if I just cast this guy and get nothing else at all, and it dies to a board wipe right away, still dealing 5 damage to each of my opponents. That's not terrible. I mean, it's not great for 7 mana. I love dice triggers on creatures, and that's why, because I cast this big creature and it immediately dies to my opponent's Wrath of God that they just cast. At least I'm getting something out of it. And of course, the more I can pull off before that happens, you could just end a game with this guy very easily, throwing the 3 damage around, piling counters on him. He eventually dies and wipes out my opponent, right? It'll get to the point where your opponents aren't going to want to kill it because they're not going to want to take that damage, right? Certainly going to see play in a lot of those decks. Again, like a Prosper deck, this seems like an auto include. Because we have so many of those themes casting from all those different places, this card's going to see a ton of play. All right, let's talk about Blink, which is a saga, 2 blue and a black, and chapter 1, choose target creature. Its owners shuffles it into their library, then investigates. And you got to be careful here. I haven't seen this before. This is the first time I've seen it. And when the first time I saw this card, I didn't notice it. And it wasn't until like the second or third time I looked at this card that I noticed this, okay? Chapter 2, choose target creature. Its owner shuffles it into the library. No, that's chapter 3. You got to look at those numbers. This is the one I noticed it on. I don't know how many others they're doing this, but this one, chapter 1, you're going to choose target creature, its owner shuffles into the library, then investigates. Then you're going to skip to that next ability, which is where chapter 2 is. Create a 2/2 black alien angel artifact creature token with first strike, vigilance, and whenever an opponent casts a creature spell, this permanent isn't a creature until end of turn. So again, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a whole lot of flavor here with the show. I'm not sure what exactly this means, but just judging this on its face, 4 mana, this comes down. Again, shuffling your opponent's creature in their library is pretty great removal. And in blue and black colors, I guess black's getting better and better at exile, so you don't have that much of an issue dealing with indestructible creatures and stuff like that. However, it is a pretty neat way to get rid of your opponent's creatures, so I'm going to shuffle one of my opponent's creatures. I mean, again, I guess you can use it on yourself. Its owner shuffles it into their library, so you can use it on yourself. Again, the secret commander scenario or whatever. Not sure if you ever want to do that. Likely you're going to use it on your opponent. Then we skip to chapter 2. We create a token, which is not bad. Then we go back to chapter 3, shuffle another creature into our opponent's library, and then go back and create another 2/2 token. Pretty great value. Assuming your opponents don't get it off the battlefield. This is 4 mana. I get rid of 2 of my opponent's creatures, and I also create 2/2 tokens. Not bad. I will say, though, again, you can use it on yourself. So if you're really hard up for card draw, I can chapter 2 create that alien angel artifact creature token, and then chapter 3, I can shuffle it into my library, which of course it will disappear because I want to investigate, right? I can do it on myself because I really need the card draw. There is that option as well. So I like the versatility here. I think it's a neat card for sure. All right, let's talk about Displaced Dinosaurs. 5 green dinosaurs. Again, another dinosaur. Another real expensive one. Another one that, again, if you're in those dino tribal decks, just like with the other one, you look at this card, it doesn't look very Doctor Who-ish or sci-fi-ish. It just looks like a dinosaur. So it can very easily fit into your dinosaur tribal deck, right? If you want to. It's a 7/7. As a historic permanent enters the battlefield under your control, it becomes a 7/7 dinosaur creature token in addition to its other types. Wow, that is a very powerful ability. And there's a lot of cards, particularly in the commanders, which I will get to in the next video. A lot of these replacement effects where you're taking this thing that a lot of decks are doing already, and we're just either transforming it into a better ability or we're adding on to it. There's lots of that going on in this set. Where are you going to put this? If I have a Saga deck that is green, I am going to cast that, and that's a historic permanent. It enters the battlefield, and it becomes a 7/7 dinosaur in addition to it. So it's doing all the things that I get the chapter 1, I get all the things I'm doing, but now I'm also turning my enchantments into 7/7 dinosaurs that I can block with, attack with, whatever. So there's just so much going on here. This is, again, a very important card that needs to be taken note of because of all the things you can do with it. Like I cast an Arcane Signet. That is a historic permanent. It enters the battlefield as a 7/7 dinosaur creature. So now my Arcane Signet is a 7/7 body, right? I guess you could put this in your dinosaur tribal deck, but it's probably not going to be super useful there. I don't know if you want to do that. I think more likely you're going to want to put this in Saga Tribal, Artifact Tribal, maybe Legendary Tribal, because now all your legends are going to be 7/7s. So it's a very impactful card in a lot of decks for sure. All right, let's talk about the Pandorica, which I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but this is another way to deal with stuff that, again, not that like White needed any more of it, but this is a really interesting card. 2 and a white legendary artifact. You may choose not to untap the Pandorica during your untap step. 1 and a white and tap. Untap another target non-land permanent, then it phases out. So this is another way in white to deal with a non-land permanent. Any non-land permanent. It can't phase in for as long as the Pandorica remains tapped. So of course, that's where that plays into that first part. When the Pandorica becomes untapped or leaves the battlefield, that permanent phases in, activate only as a sorcery. So, if I'm, again, looking at white removal, I have Generous Gift, which is probably the best way. Got Stroke of Midnight, which just came out in Wilds of Eldraine, which is a great way to deal with non-land permanents. 3 mana, instant speed. Why would I want to play this? So, I'd want to play this for a couple of reasons. Reason number 1, I can phase out my own stuff. Again, I can phase out my commander and just leave it phased out for whatever reason. Maybe I want to protect it. You can only do this at sorcery speed, so you can't instant speed protect your commander, unfortunately. You could just have this sitting on the battlefield. This is why I love about cards like this, right? I have this sitting on the battlefield. I phase out my commander because I'm about to cast a board wipe. I cast that Wrath of God, kill all the other creatures, and then on my next untap, I let this untap, and of course it says when it becomes untapped, that permanent phases in. Normally it would phase in on the untap as well, but because there's a special stipulation here that says when this becomes untapped, that phases in. So now on my next turn, I have my commander back and everyone else's creatures are dead. And then later in the game, so I'm giving arguments for why this might be better than a Stroke of Midnight or a Generous Gift, right? Now my opponent's commander is like a Corvold that's looking pretty menacing. I phase that out. And of course, why phasing works so good with your opponent's commanders is because it's not changing zones. So that is a more permanent way to deal with your opponent, right? If they have a Corvold and you kill it, just next turn, I'll just cast it again because I can ramp like crazy or I got treasure tokens or whatever. So it doesn't really slow them down a whole lot. With this, I can phase out their commander and it stays phased out for as long as this guy remains on the battlefield and tapped. So that is, again, maybe a Generous Gift or a Stroke of Midnight's not very good there because they'll just recast their commander in a turn, where this can keep their commander off the battlefield for an extended period of time. So it might be a little niche, but at the same time, I think you could throw this in any deck and you'll find a lot of really neat ways to use it in a commander game. Let's talk about Weeping Angel. 1 blue and a black alien angel, 2/2, has flash, first strike, vigilance whenever an opponent casts a creature spell. Weeping Angel isn't a creature until end of turn. So again, with that phrasing, so again, I'm sure there's some connection to the show why it's like that. So your opponents can shut this off, right? Turn it into, it's not a creature, so I guess it's just going to be an artifact. It has abilities, but the abilities don't mean anything, right? Because of course, first strike and vigilance don't do anything if on an artifact, obviously. Also though, if Weeping Angel would deal combat damage to a creature, prevent that damage, and that creature's owner shuffles it into their library. So again, that ability obviously is going to do nothing if your Weeping Angel is not a creature. So that is a way for your opponent to shut it off for a turn, which is going to be really important because if they couldn't do that, this card would be busted, right? Because first of all, it's got flash, and the flash part is important because this is just fantastic creature removal. Essentially, this is 3 mana instant speed. I shuffle my opponent's creature into their library, which is pretty good. It's not super great. Again, black and blue have pretty good creature removal already. So it's not going to be super. That's worst case scenario here is my opponent's attacking with their Blightsteel Colossus. I flash this in. Of course, I'm going to declare it as a blocker. And what happens, because this has first strike, it's going to deal its damage first. If it would deal combat damage to a creature, again, here's that replacement effect thing I was talking about, for which there's a lot in this set. You're going to prevent the damage. So I'm not going to deal any damage to that Blightsteel Colossus or whatever, Avacyn, whatever the creature is. Instead, I'm going to shuffle it into their library. So who cares about the damage in that situation, right? Because I'm shuffling their Avacyn into their library, which is fantastic. But that's going to be the scenario where you're going to want to use this. If I have this in my deck, I'm just going to use it as instant speed removal. And then going forward, it's a pretty fantastic blocker where my opponent just can't attack me. If my opponent, again, now this is already on the battlefield, my opponent attacks their Avacyn. Okay, I'll block with my Weeping Angel, right? That first ability makes it so it's not so busted because you could just sit there forever and my opponents can't attack me. Now my opponent will have to cast a creature. They cast a creature spell on their first main phase. This shuts off. It turns into just a regular old artifact that doesn't do anything. Then they can attack with that creature, right? So that's what they're going to have to do if they want to attack me. So pretty great, right? If I'm in a blue-black deck, I might take out one of my instant speed removals just and put this guy in because it is a pretty darn decent instant speed removal option for my opponent's creatures, and then it sits on the battlefield, just sort of, it's sort of like an obstacle for my opponents that they have to get around. It's just a pain in the butt for them. All right, let's talk about Everything Comes to Dust, because of course, every set has a new white board wipe, and we have to evaluate whether or not it is as good or better than the ones we already have. 7 white, 10 mana. Oh boy, that's a lot. Horrible. Why would you ever play it? It's a sorcery, of course, like most board wipes are, but it has Convoke. And of course, the casting cost is going to be less relevant because Convoke means we can cast it by tapping down our creatures. I'm sure everyone's familiar with it. Exile all creatures, except those that share a creature type with a creature that convoked this spell. All artifacts and all enchantments. Okay, so let's break it down. Let's evaluate this. Getting away from the Convoke part, first of all, this is going to exile all creatures and artifacts and enchantments. So we're already in like farewell territory here, where that's super impactful, right? You can't get around, again, the phasing is the only way you can get around that. It's going to get rid of the Blightsteel Colossuses, and it gets around hexproof, indestructible, all that, which is fantastic. And obviously gets away from your opponent can't recur it. I mean, I think we all know by now why exile is so much better than, destroying or whatever else. So if I just had that, if I just had a spell that exiles all creatures, artifacts, and enchantments that I could convoke to cast it for cheaper. I mean, you can cast this for free. This could be, if you have 10 creatures in play and at least 3 of them are white, I can cast this for free, which is insane. But obviously that's a lot of creatures, all right? Maybe there are some decks that can pull this off. Just reducing this by 4, let's throw that out there. Let's reduce this by 4. It is now 6 mana. So I got 4 creatures and I'm going to tap them all down. It doesn't matter that they're tapped because of course I'm exiling everything anyway. 6 mana, I exile all creatures, artifacts, and enchantment. That's pretty, again, now we're in farewell territory. That's not bad. However, as I say all the time on my channel, I prefer the board wipes that advantage me. If I have some stuff left over after everything's been hit, that's great for me. It gives me a nice big advantage, right? Exile all creatures except those that share a type with the creature that convoked this spell. So that means if and I got to be careful here because of course this includes my opponents as well. That's where the things get real tricky, right? If I tap down all my creatures to cast this, that means my creatures don't get touched at all because of course they all share a type that convoked this spell. Now I'm in a tribal deck. I'm in soldier tribal. I tap my commander that's a soldier. All my creatures are soldiers and of course they share a type with that creature that convoked the spell. So all my soldiers are going to be safe. And I don't have to, right? Now I can exile my opponent's stuff, and now my untapped soldiers I can now attack with. Again, now you're in the one-sided board wipe territory. However, now all humans and all soldiers are going to be saved by Everything Comes to Dust. Now, I will just say, that doesn't sound great because, of course, the chances my opponents have some soldiers is not bad. The chances they have humans is probably pretty good. Almost every deck, unless you're like a goblin tribal deck or something, outside of the tribal theme, funny enough, is where you're going to run into the situation where my opponent opponent's commander is probably a human, right? You're going to run into that situation likely, so they're not going to get ahead. However, I will just say you're still hitting all the artifacts and enchantments, right? Kind of the worst case scenario with this card is I exile all the artifacts and enchantments. There is no stipulation there. This can be, yeah, I tap down all my creatures and maybe I don't hit any of my opponent's creatures because they're all playing humans and soldiers. I still get all the artifacts and enchantments. So that's pretty good too, right? So this is a bit of a toughie. It is. There are probably a few decks where this is going to be extra good. I can control this in a way that I can tap down all my creatures so that none of them die. It's very easy for me to make sure none of my creatures get exiled with this. That's why I think it's really good. And as long as I don't care so much about the artifacts and enchantments, that seems pretty good. If I don't get any of my opponent's creatures, maybe I'll get one or two, right? So this is definitely going to see it play in the format. Where's it going to see play? It could be a toughie. You might have to play this card a few times to realize where it's good. It's definitely an interesting board wipe. Really interesting one. Hard to evaluate for sure on its face. All right, moving on to Riversongs Diary, 3-mana artifact. And of course, as I say all the time, these colorless options, right? The artifacts, the stuff that can fit in any deck is obviously going to see more play because color identity is not an issue here. Has imprint. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell from their hand, exile it instead of putting it into their graveyard as it resolves. So again, we have that replacement effect. Like I said, a lot of cards like that in this set. Wording is important here. Of course, imprint, I think we're all familiar with what that does. It's exiling it and printing it on this card whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell. So of course it's working on everybody, which is valuable. The other important wording here is from their hand. So of course this isn't going to work with the from anywhere else. It's only going to work from hand, and you're going to exile it instead of putting it into their graveyard as it resolves. So again, now it's going to be hosing maybe some decks. Again, if someone's using that return the past in their deck, now none of their instants or sorceries are going to be going to the graveyard. So they're not going to be able to use that. They're not going to be able to use the flashback. You're exiling them instead of putting them anywhere else. So, I mean, it's kind of graveyard hate, not great, but it will work there. So if you're doing it a lot, I mean, again, this is another situation where this can go in any deck. You know, I know people will look at the instant sorcery theme and think, oh, well, maybe I want it in a Spellslinger deck, or maybe I want it to hose my buddy's Spellslinger deck. You can put this in any game, and it's just going to sit there. You know, it's going to exile someone's Kodama's Reach. It's going to exile someone's Generous Gift again. That stuff just happens in every game, right? What are you getting for it, though, at the beginning of your upkeep? If there are 4 or more cards exiled with Riversongs Diary, which again, I think going to happen very quickly. It could happen in one turn cycle. Choose one of them at random. You may cast it without paying its mana cost. That seems pretty good. So now, again, I played this. My opponent cast a Kodama's Reach. The next guy played a Generous Gift. The next guy played whatever. And now, at the beginning of my upkeep, I get to choose one of those at random. So now I cast a Kodama's Reach and go get 2 basic lands out of my deck, put them into play. The next turn, I randomly choose the Generous Gift, destroy a permanent, right? There's really not a lot of downside here. Again, as I've talked about recently, I don't love random chance, but this is just free value. That's what I do like. I don't love the random. I do love the free value, where this is just going to sit there and it's going to give me that stuff. And again, this is the Wandering Archaic situation where it's allowing me to do stuff outside of the color pie. So now, again, I'm in a mono red deck and I'm casting that Kodama's Reach that I can't ramp in red. So now I get to go get those lands and put them directly into play. Or I'm in that mono blue deck that I can't deal with enchantments, and now I can cast that Generous Gift that's going to allow me to hit my opponent's Smothering Tithe, right? So that's another reason why this is a fantastic include in a lot of decks. And again, this is a situation where you could very easily put this in any deck, and it's just going to be great value for you. It's going to put in a lot of work, I guarantee it. All right, getting near the end here, let's talk about Vashta Narata, 2 and a black alien horror 1/1. And again, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but I'm doing my best here, all right? Indestructible and Shadow. So we got another Shadow creature, and if you're not familiar with it, it means it can block or be blocked by only creatures with Shadow. So that essentially, not a guarantee, Dauthi Voidwalker is a pretty popular card in the Commander format, which has Shadow, but it's almost a guarantee that this guy's going to be unblockable, okay? So it's indestructible and it's unblockable. And at the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Vashta Narata, which of course is the Morbid ability. This is a situation where, yes, this can very easily slot into any deck where you're just having lots of dies triggers all the time. I'm sacrificing my creatures, any of those Aristocrats decks. I'm killing my opponent's creatures a lot, but also I can put this in any deck. Just like with the Instants and Sorcery theme, yeah, it fits better in certain themes, but Creatures are dying all over the place in a commander game already. My opponent sacrifices a Superb Dryad Elder. At the beginning of that end step, their turn, I get a counter on my guy. Someone Infernal grasps one of their other creatures on the battlefield. I get a counter on my guy, right? It just happens all the time, no matter what. So this guy, again, I can put in any deck, comes down, 3 mana is not a lot, and he just sits there. He's indestructible, hard to get off the battlefield, and he's just going to sit there collecting counters, and he's just going to be a huge beater that's likely unblockable. But again, in certain decks, get even better. So, you know, again, this is just one of those cards that can very easily slot into a whole lot of decks and just is a pretty good finisher. Again, if I'm in that Aristocrats deck, like I talked about in my WinCons video, yeah, my WinCon there is the Blood Artist that I'm draining my opponents with, but I'm sacrificing lots of creatures anyway. So why not throw this guy in there? Because at the end of the day, I'm just reducing my opponent's life total to 0, and this guy's certainly going to speed it up. So why not throw him in there, right? This guy's going to fit in a lot of decks for sure. All right, Cyber Conversion, blue and a blue instant. Turn target creature face down. It's a 2/2 Cybermen artifact creature. So this is a removal option in blue for creatures. I would say blue is a pretty darn good color at removing creatures. So it's not like we're desperate for it. I'm going to reference a few cards here. First of all, I'm going to reference Ixodron, which is a card I talked about. I think I talked about in a short where I was talking about how it will ruin your day because it turns maybe your commander face down, and there's no way to turn it face up unless your commander has morph. Right? If a card is face down, it's not like Manifest. If a card is turned face down for whatever reason, unless you have some way to turn it face up, so I got an Ixodor in my deck, or I'm playing my Ixodor deck, that turns face down creatures face up, or I have some other way to do it, it's just going to stay face down. So again, just like I talked about with the Pandorica, this is doing something very similar where I can semi-permanently shut off my opponent's commander, where my opponent's playing that Corval deck, really powerful commander that I know if I kill it, they can just cast it again very easily. So instead of Rapid Hybridization, I use this guy and I turn their Corval face down. It's now a 2/2 Cyberman artifact creature, and of course, doesn't have any of the abilities on the downside. We're only looking at the upside. So this is a they probably got lots of sack outlets in that deck, but still, I turn it face down and it's shut. I shut it off for an extended period of time. It's a great card for that. And again, this is a card that you just got to be aware of because now it exists in the format and I'm playing my whatever deck and my opponent can just turn my commander face down and I don't have access to it unless I can figure out a way to have it die, right? Again, just like with the Ixodron situation, 99% of the time, you just have to have your commander die. All right, let's talk about the moment, which I'm sure is a very popular moment in the Doctor Who show. Whatever it is, I'm sure someone who's a fan of the show will explain it to me, but in the game of Magic, it is a legendary artifact. It costs 2 mana, and again, we're in the situation of this can go on any deck, right? So at the beginning of your upkeep, put a time counter on the moment. So very important, we're dealing with the time counter thing. Pay 2 and tap. Untap target creature you control. It phases out until the moment leaves the battlefield. So again, very similar thing with the phasing, except here we're doing it to our own creatures only. But there's a very important reason why. Pay 3 and tap. Destroy each non-land permanent with mana value less than or equal to the number of time counters on the moment. Then sacrifice the moment. Activate only as a sorcery. So we've seen this effect before. As a board wipe removal option, it's not great because, of course, it's slow. It's putting 1 counter on it every upkeep. So that's the disadvantage here, where it's kind of slow. The advantage, it's not like Blast Zone, where Blast Zone does just that mana value, or Ratchet Bomb, that just does that mana value. This is that mana value or less. So you're getting a lot more stuff. It's more like a pernicious deed there, where it's however much you pay and then everything below it. Obviously, we can, again, do the proliferate thing, the time counter thing. You can get more value out of it. And then on top of that, pay 2, untap target creature you control phases out. I get to save, right? While I'm waiting for those time counters to accumulate on this, I can untap target creature I control and it phases out until this leaves the battlefield and then do it the next turn, right? I don't have to do this just once. I could do it to another creature and another creature. I can save all my creatures if I want to. It would be very similar to an Oblivion Stone there, where I can put those fade counters on my stuff that I don't want to blow up. This is going to do something very similar. So it's a really neat, how good is it? How much are you going to use it? Unlike the Pandorica, this, I can instant speed phase out my stuff. So I guess worst case scenario here is someone's about to remove my commander. pay 2 mana and tap, I phase out my commander and it doesn't get killed. Now, it's not going to phase back in until this leaves the battlefield, which I am in control of. So, of course, the very next turn, pay 3, destroy. Maybe I'll get someone's Soul Ring or something, but then my commander phases back in. So it can be used in situations like that as well. It's a pretty neat card for sure. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the Curse of Fenrick, which is a very unique, interesting card. Again, someone can explain to me what exactly is going on here, because this is a really weird card, and I thought it would be a fun one to talk about. I don't know if it's going to be super impactful in the format, how much it's going to get played, but I think it's a neat one. So 2 green and a white, and again, it's a saga. A lot of sagas in this set. Chapter 1, for each player, destroy up to 1 target creature that player controls. For each creature destroyed this way, its controller creates a 3/3 green mutant creature token with Death Touch. So I'm in a 4-player game. This comes down, and I'm going to pick a creature for each player. So for each player, obviously my opponents and myself, I have to pick one, and I'm going to destroy a creature. So that's pretty good. I get to destroy each, if I have something I don't really care about, maybe I got a Farhaven Elf in play, I already got my land, it can go away. I'll turn it into a 3/3 creature with Death Touch. That seems pretty great. And then also I get my opponent's commanders or their best creatures off the battlefield. That seems pretty great. Not bad. Chapter 2, target non-token creature becomes a 6/6 legendary horror creature named Fenrick and loses all abilities. So now, again, this is a very weird ability where I can use it on myself or I can use it on my opponent. So now, again, I have that Farhaven Elf in play. I can now turn my Farhaven Elf, because it's just sitting there doing nothing. It's just a 1/1. So I'm just turning it into a bigger creature. I can also turn my opponent's, again, Korvold, into a 6/6 legendary horror creature named Fenrick that loses all abilities. So now my opponent's really powerful commander just becomes a 6/6 creature with no abilities, which, 6/6 is pretty big, but you don't care about that. You care about the abilities on that Korvold, right? And again, this is the Oko situation that, when that card first came out, I think a lot of people, I myself didn't even realize, oh, it just turns your commander into that creature permanently. That is the case here as well, where I'm turning my opponent's Korvold permanently into this creature, not until end of turn, not until this leaves the battlefield. It is permanently a legendary horror creature named Fenrick. So again, just like those other cards I talked about, this is a more permanent way to deal with your opponent's pesky commander. However, we got another really interesting chapter here. Chapter 3, target mutant fights another target creature named Fenrick. So of course, there are already a bunch of mutants on the battlefield from the first ability. You probably have one. So the Fenrick creature that you just created is going to fight a mutant. Now, this is both a good thing and a bad thing. So again, that's why this card is so unique, because I can use it in a few different ways, depending on what have I turned Fenrick into, or what have I turned into Fenrick. If I turn my creature into Fenrick and there's a mutant on the battlefield, remember they have Death Touch. So if I fight one of those mutants, I'm now going to lose my creature. So now this ability comes less good, right? For the people who are like, oh man, I can turn my opponent's Korvold permanently into a creature with no abilities. That's great. However, the very next chapter says you got to fight a mutant. So if there's other mutants on the battlefield that have Death Touch, now that their Korvold, their commander, has to fight one of those mutants, so of course it'll die. Now, of course, that's not bad, but now I can't lock them out of the game. Now of course, their commander will go back to the command zone so they can cast it again. So now I've sort of undone that advantage that I had there. So it's an interesting one. Again, the fact that you are picking all these different creatures to do all these different things, and particularly with the second and third ability, like what you do with the second ability is going to be very dependent on what happens with the third ability. And with the second ability, I can pick my creature to turn into Fenrick, or I can pick my opponent's creature. I can do a whole bunch of, it's just a very weird, versatile card that does a whole lot. It's very interesting. Again, this is one of those cards that you sort of got to see it play out in a commander game to see how effective it really can be. It certainly is a neat one, without a doubt. All right, that is it. That is all. A very long video, but I got to talk about these cards. Again, there's a lot of people that probably will completely skip over this set. I know I have patrons that they don't touch any of the Universes Beyond stuff. They won't touch it, but they're going to have to interact with it because they're going to see stuff like this in a commander game likely. So I'm bringing your awareness to it. So if you're the people that really like this set, here's a bunch of cards that you can definitely go out and play. And again, for me, I'm sort of in the middle, I guess. It's likely that I will be getting some of these cards to put in some of my commander deck because they're pretty good commander cards, right? And some of them fit really, really well in some of my decks. So I likely will be doing so. But even for the people that don't love this set, I'm making you aware of these cards because they now exist in the format, and there are some really impactful ones here. So you guys let me know in the comments below what you think of these new cards, the ones I talked about, and some others as well. Maybe what you think of this set overall. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.